Hello, Ted Morrissey. This is a video for my experimental writing course for Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing program. So we've reached the point in the session where we are looking at some pretty obscure, difficult to grasp kinds of pieces. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about whether or not obscurity is a good thing or not when it comes to fiction writing. And in the other video, I'm going to give you a link to. I talk about a little bit different subject matter. I talk about how we can appreciate stories that we don't fully comprehend. And in that, I look in particular at the modernist writer Gertrude Stein, and I kind of use William H. Gass's analysis of Gertrude Stein, particularly her avant garde poem, Tender Buttons, to get at that subject and to, again, kind of explore this idea of how do we appreciate a piece of writing that we don't fully comprehend. So I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. But in this video, like I said, I want to talk about this idea of writing a prose piece that isn't fully comprehensible. I think poets are comfortable with the idea of writing sort of abstract work, of using, difficult at times metaphors. And I think we're used to reading poetry that doesn't maybe at first fully land in terms of comprehending it and so on. But prose writers oftentimes, I think, are under the impression that everything they write should be crystal clear. I think when we workshop short stories and novel excerpts and so forth, if there's anything that isn't crystal clear, if there's some ambiguity, that can come under fire, that can be criticized as a shortcoming or whatever. But that isn't necessarily the case. So that's what I want to devote this video to. I don't think it'll be a very long one, but I guess we'll find out. Speaking of obscurity, kind of the crown jewel of obscurity is this book, of course, James Joyce's Finnegans Wake. If you're familiar at all, you know that it is all but unintelligible, especially on a first reading or fifth or 50th. I'm a Joyce fan. In fact, I teach a course in Ulysses, which is also a challenging book, but not nearly as abstruse as Finnegans Wake. When I retired from full-time teaching about a year and a half ago, one of the first things I did was to join an online Finnegans Wake reading group. So for the last year and a half, every Thursday evening, I get together with other Finnegans Wake enthusiasts via Zoom, and we talk about Finnegans Wake. And like I said, I've been doing it now for a year and a half. And of course, before that, for years, I've been reading Finnegans Wake on my own and reading about Finnegans Wake. So I kind of grasp what the story is about, if there is a story. But generally speaking, it's still quite opaque. And one of the gentlemen in the Finnegans Wake group has been reading Finnegans Wake for 60 years. And he says he still doesn't fully grasp what all the various pieces are about and so on. So anyway, when Joyce was working on this, obscurity was one of his goals. It took him about 17 years to write Finnegans Wake. It came out ultimately in 1939. It like other of Joyce's novels, it was published serially, so it came out in bits and pieces over those 17 years, and then ultimately he had to kind of take all those drafts of those early versions and kind of put them together into the book form. And always for Joyce, when he revised, whether it was Finnegans Wake or Ulysses or whatever it was, he was always trying to add layers of complexity and nuance and so forth. And that is certainly true with Finnegans Wake. Every time he revised it, and particularly when he was revising it to be published as a book, his goal was to make it more and more obscure, make it harder to understand, make the reader have to work harder and harder to figure out what the heck is going on. He claimed as he was working on bringing all these pieces together and revising them for the book that looking at some of the earliest sections, he wasn't even sure what it was about. Now, we're not quite sure if he was completely joking, because he was James Joyce, of course, whether he was dead serious or maybe a little bit of both. But obscurity was the point. And that obscurity is actually added to the mystique of the book. And here we are all these years later, and there are these reading groups all over the world that all they do is read and discuss Finnegans Wake and try to figure out what the heck Joyce was talking about. This is obviously an extreme example, probably more extreme than what most of us would want to try to produce ourselves. So I want to also talk about this writer, Robert Coover. Robert Coover is one of those kind of high priests of postmodernism. He's been publishing, I think, since the 1960s. Lots of short stories, lots of novels, that kind of thing. And he didn't necessarily aim for obscurity, but he certainly was comfortable with ambiguity as an art form. All right. So I want to talk about that and give you some examples of that. But while I'm at it, I will allude to this Robert Coover story collection, in particular, A Child Again, because it is a collection of revisionist fiction. As you will recall from the last couple of weeks, I've talked a little bit about revisionist fiction. That's a kind of fiction that I'm particularly fond of, both as a reader and a writer. And I teach a couple of courses in revisionist works here in the Lindenwood program. But revisionist fiction is where you take a well-known story, a well-known novel, probably a classic, and rework it somehow, kind of tell your own tale, inspired by it. Maybe it's a prequel, maybe it's a sequel. I've got a dog that's about to start barking, so I'm going to pause, and I'll be right back. So in this particular collection, what Coover did was to look at nursery rhymes, kind of classic children's stories, and rework them somehow or another, right? And so I just wanted to kind of point this out because this is a really good example of revisionist fiction, and it's something we've been talking about. But let's get to this idea of ambiguity. Again, oftentimes prose writers try to avoid ambiguous story details, characterization details, and so forth. And if they find themselves, or if they're found in our writing, it's generally considered to be a bad thing. But Coover, that was sort of his primary interest, or one of them anyway, as a fiction writer, was to deliberately put ambiguous details into his fiction. In my first introduction to Coover, I was just an undergraduate, a freshman at SIU Carbondale. There we go, Salukis. Go Dogs. But I was a freshman taking my very first college creative writing class with Philip Graham, who was a great writer and a great teacher. And one of the stories he had us read was The Babysitter. And this story absolutely blew me away. As you can see, The Babysitter is composed of these very brief vignettes. And you may be familiar with The Babysitter. Like I said, it's a classic story. It's been highly anthologized. Many, many years ago, it was made into a movie starring Alicia Silverstone when she was kind of the height of her popularity. And so it's a very well-known text. So again, you may be familiar, but The Babysitter is sort of classic Robert Coover, in that as you start to read these vignettes about this teenage girl who's babysitting, and then the sort of people around her. There's my dog again. Hold on. Okay, I'm back again. So the babysitter. So this teenage girl is going to babysit these two kids, and we find out about the family that she's babysitting for, and then she's got a boyfriend out there, et cetera, et cetera. It all starts to kind of add up, these little vignettes, but then suddenly they start to not add up. In other words, information we start to get in this vignette starts to contradict maybe a little bit something we learned earlier in the story. And at first it's sort of unsettling, and it's like, did I misread something? and then you read further, and the further you go, the more you realize we don't know what's going on in this story. These vignettes are contradictory. There's various possibilities in terms of what's happening in this story. And the thing is, Coover doesn't privilege a particular reading. Obviously, we're very familiar with unreliable narrators and not being able to take everything at face value necessarily that we're being given in a short story or a novel. But usually, I think the author will give us sort of a nudge in a particular direction. Maybe we have some ambiguous details, but we're sort of encouraged perhaps to read in a particular way. Not in Coover. He doesn't help us at all. He just gives us all these possibilities, and they're all equally valid or invalid, however you'd like to look at them. And that's all we get. But yet it's very, very engaging. It's haunting. It really makes us think about the narrative. The fact that it is unresolvable makes it linger with us after the story is over. And that was my first introduction to Robert Coover, was The Babysitter. Again, not every single thing he has written is like that, but a lot of it is. A couple of years ago, I was invited to contribute to an anthology of essays on Coover's work, which I very much appreciated. And I decided I wanted to work with this Coover novel, Noir, which is sort of his reworking of the classic hardboiled gumshoe detective novel. And again, in Noir, on the one hand, the sentence for sentence is very clear, and we understand exactly kind of what's going on in each sentence. So there isn't the sort of obscurity, lack of clarity that we get in someone like Joyce, for example. But nevertheless, as you read on, there are things that we just don't know for sure. We have conflicting details, conflicting character details, plot details, setting details. And Coover doesn't help us out in terms of, well, this, I'm giving you these options, but I think you should probably kind of lean in this direction. Nothing is privileged. Every narrative option is as valid, or as I say, as invalid as any other. Now, again, if we were to typically turn in a short story in a workshopping setting, or if we're part of a writer's group and we give our friends, a short story or a novel chapter that has these conflicting things going on, and the dates don't add up and the character details don't add up, the suspicion would be, oh, we really dropped the ball as a writer. We need to go back and revise and kind of iron out those details so that everything fits smoothly together. But Coover deliberately wants things to be ambiguous. And again, as a writing choice, it definitely has an impact on how the reader perceives the work, how it forces them to think about it, and again, how it kind of lingers after we stop reading. I mean, here I am, many, many years later, and I'm still talking about The Babysitter and still remember it quite well, just from that very first reading when I was just an 18-year-old kid who one day wanted to be a writer of some sort, right? So in some forms of writing, clarity is absolutely, the goal. I used to have a neighbor many, many years ago who was a technical writer. She was from Canada. Not that that had anything to do with her being a technical writer, but it was great that she was from Canada because, one, she was really polite, and two, we got to celebrate Thanksgiving twice while we were neighbors. That was great. But anyway, technical writer, so she wrote instruction manuals and those kinds of things. And so for her, clarity was absolutely essential. That was her primary goal. You shouldn't have to reread sentences of a technical writer to figure out what the heck they're talking about, because it should be crystal clear on the first reading. My original kind of roots were in journalism. I was a newspaper reporter for a number of years. I was originally a journalism major when I first went to college, and then changed over to English with an emphasis in creative writing eventually. But my earliest experience with publication was as a journalist. So again, as a journalist, my goal was to be super clear, super accurate. People shouldn't have to reread my stories to figure out, what I was writing about, etc. So there certainly are forms of writing where clarity is paramount. But in creative writing, in fiction writing, yeah, in certain genres, certainly clarity is still very, very important. But when it comes to literary fiction, ambiguity, obscurity is an option, is a deliberate option that some writers might take. So as you kind of move forward with your own writing, think about, whether some ambiguity, some deliberate, lack of clarity might be a really interesting technique to play with. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about the possibilities for deliberate obscurity and ambiguity, and I will see you down the digital trail.